Laura Whitman stood frozen in the center of her own living room, her keys still clutched in a white-knuckled grip. The heavy mahogany dresser that had belonged in the dining room for years now sat barricaded across the front hallway, forcing her to squeeze through a gap like a trespasser. The air, once smelling of her favorite lavender, was thick and suffocating with the sharp, medicinal sting of lemon wax and stewed cabbage. From the kitchen came the rhythmic, aggressive thud of a heavy knife hitting wood, a sound that felt less like cooking and more like a declaration of war. She hurried toward the nursery, desperate to see her son, but a dry, papery palm slammed firmly over the door handle, blocking her path. Behind the wood, there was only a chilling, unnatural silence, where there should have been the evening chaos of play. Her mother-in-law didn't move, her icy gray eyes fixed on the clock as she let out a long, sibilant hiss for silence. In that moment, looking at the rearranged furniture and the stranger guarding her child's door, Laura realized the locks hadn't been broken, but her home had been occupied nonetheless. Heavy rain pelted the windshield of the sedan, each drop exploding into 1,000 shards of liquid crystal. The city of Minneapolis dissolved into a smear of neon blues and pulsating reds, a watercolor painting left out in the storm. Laura Whitman gripped the leather steering wheel, her knuckles protruding like white stones under the skin. Every few seconds, the wipers scraped across the glass with a mechanical groan, struggling to clear the deluge that instantly reclaimed the view. The air conditioning hummed, blowing a thin stream of frigid air that made the fine hairs on her forearms stand on end. She felt a knot tightening in her chest, a physical obstruction that prevented a full breath from reaching her lungs. The muffled roar of the city felt distant yet predatory. Laura stared at the glowing red brake lights of the cars ahead, trapped in a slow-moving river of steel. A slick, cold dread crawled up her spine, vibrating at the base of her skull. The prospect of returning home didn't offer the usual sanctuary. Instead, it felt like approaching the mouth of a trap. The key turned in the lock with a familiar metallic click, but as Laura pushed the heavy oak door open, the expected sight of her hallway failed to greet her. She stumbled, her hip nearly colliding with a massive mahogany dresser that had, until this morning, occupied a quiet corner of the dining room. It now stood as a barricade in the narrow foyer, forcing her to turn sideways and squeeze past the polished wood. The sharp, medicinal scent of lemon wax hung heavy in the air, a pungent invader that had completely eradicated her preferred aroma of dried lavender. She caught a glimpse of herself in the gilt-framed mirror, now moved to the opposite wall, and the pale, startled woman staring back looked like a trespasser in her own life. Every object seemed shifted by a few inches, a subtle sabotage of her spatial memory that rendered the familiar alien. The house felt distorted, a reflection in a funhouse mirror where she no longer possessed the coordinates to navigate her own reality. From the direction of the kitchen, an aggressive hiss of searing fat erupted, followed by the rhythmic, percussive thud of a heavy knife meeting a wooden board. Laura froze in the doorway, her lungs burning as she inhaled the cloying, humid scent of stewed cabbage and rendered bacon. The smell was thick enough to coat the back of her throat, clinging to the heavy velvet curtains and the very wallpaper. Joyce stood with her back to the entrance, a figure of rigid authority. She wielded a massive silver ladle, stirring a bubbling pot that Laura recognized as her own heirloom Dutch oven. Steam billowed from the stove in thick, white plumes, obscuring the window glass with a ghostly veil. Joyce did not turn, but the sudden tension in her narrow shoulders signaled that she had registered Laura's arrival. She chose to ignore it, focusing instead on the roiling liquid, as if the act of cooking was a holy rite that could not be interrupted by the mere presence of the home's legal owner. Joyce turned with agonizing slowness, her movements calculated and theatrical. She cast a pointed look at the large clock on the kitchen wall before shifting her icy gray gaze to the watch on Laura's wrist. Her thin lips, painted a sharp, blood red, compressed into a line of silent, devastating judgment. Without a word, Joyce reached out and dragged a single manicured finger across the top shelf of a nearby bookcase. She held her hand out, presenting the evidence like a prosecutor. A faint, almost invisible smudge of gray dust on her fingertip. Her voice, when it finally emerged, was dry and brittle, a sound like dead leaves skittering across pavement. She began a precise tally of the minutes Laura had arrived late, her tones shifting seamlessly into a critique of the neglected corners of the house. As Joyce flicked her hand to dismiss the invisible filth, Laura saw the woman's fingers tremble. Not with age, but with the quiet, vibrating energy of a hunter who had successfully cornered its prey. Laura took a determined step toward the hallway leading to the nursery, her heart hammering against her ribs. But Joyce moved with surprising speed, blocking the path. She stood tall, her spine a rigid rod of iron, and placed a dry, papery palm firmly over the handle of Leo's bedroom door. The physical obstruction was absolute. Joyce raised a finger to her lips, emitting a long, sibilant hiss that demanded total silence. Her eyes narrowed into slits of cold flint as Laura opened her mouth to protest. Joyce remained motionless, a living sentry at the threshold of the child's room. Laura could feel the heat radiating from the older woman's body, a stifling warmth that seemed to suck the oxygen from the air. Every attempt Laura made to bypass the barricade was met with a slight, firm repositioning of Joyce's frame. The message was unspoken, but deafening. The territory behind this door had been annexed, and Laura was no longer the sovereign of this particular province. Laura managed to ease the door open just a crack, her breath hitching as her eyes landed on the glowing blue numbers of the digital clock on the nightstand. It was barely 7 in the evening. Leo lay perfectly still beneath the weight of a heavy, woolen quilt, a sight that sent a jolt of alarm through Laura. Normally, this hour was a cacophony of clattering plastic blocks and high-pitched giggles. She noticed with a pang of resentment that Leo's favorite soft cotton pajamas had been stripped away, replaced by a stiff, scratchy flannel set that Joyce had insisted on buying. On the bedside table sat a ceramic mug, a ring of dried, warm milk clinging to the bottom. A drink Laura strictly avoided giving him before bed to prevent night terrors. The silence in the room felt artificial, a heavy shroud draped over the childhood joy that should have been there. Laura reached out to touch Leo's forehead, the realization sinking in that Joyce had forcibly truncated the boy's day, effectively stealing the final hour of connection Laura had spent the entire workday dreaming of. Laura's hands balled into fists, the crescents of her nails biting deep into the soft flesh of her palms as she hissed a series of sharp complaints about the ruined schedule. Joyce merely tilted her head, her expression shifting into the practiced, hollow mask of a long-suffering martyr. With deliberate care, Joyce smoothed an already perfect lace doily on the kitchen table, her voice dropping into a tone of condescending sweetness. She spoke of true devotion and the unquestionable needs of a child, framing her intrusion as a necessary rescue. Each word was a needle, suggesting that Laura's own negligence had led to the boy's supposed exhaustion. The air in the kitchen grew cold as Joyce's gaze hardened. Without waiting for a rebuttal, Joyce turned her back and began to clatter heavy ceramic plates into the sink with unnecessary violence. The noise served as a wall, a blunt instrument used to terminate the conversation and leave Laura standing in the center of her own kitchen, drowning in a tide of impotent fury. The front door swung open, admitting a sudden blast of damp, wintry air. And Mark, who stood shaking the Minneapolis rain from his dark trench coat. He froze on the threshold, his eyes darting between Laura's pale, vibrating form and the pinched, triumphant silhouette of his mother. The tension in the foyer was a physical cord, stretched to the point of snapping. Mark let out a hollow, nervous cough, refusing to meet Laura's gaze as he fumbled with the laces of his shoes. Sensing the shift in the room, Joyce instantly altered her posture. She slumped slightly, adopting the air of a woman exhausted by the thankless labor of domesticity. She hurried to Mark, offering him a glass of water with a trembling hand, as if she were the only one providing comfort in a hostile environment. Laura watched as Mark hunched his shoulders, a turtle retreating into its shell, desperately trying to ignore the sparks of static electricity flying between the two women in the dim, yellow light of the hallway. Laura caught Mark by the elbow and pulled him into the far corner of the living room, her voice a fierce, jagged whisper as she pointed toward the rearranged furniture and the alien atmosphere of their home. Mark's eyes wandered toward the ceiling, his fingers nervously twisting a loose button on his shirt. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a man standing on a sinking pier. When Laura demanded that he finally draw a line in the sand, that he tell Joyce she was a guest, not a commander, Mark merely exhaled a long, weary sigh. He muttered something incoherent about maintaining the peace and not making a scene. He took a deliberate step back, widening the physical gap between them, as if her anger were a contagious fever. His gaze fixed on a small, insignificant stain on the carpet, his mind clearly miles away. Before she could press him further, he suddenly claimed to remember an urgent business call and retreated into his study, leaving Laura standing alone in the shadows of a room that no longer felt like hers. Joyce marched into the master bedroom with the stride of a conquering general, a towering stack of freshly pressed linens balanced in her arms. She didn't offer the courtesy of a knock or an explanation. Instead, she began to whip open the drawers of Laura's dresser, her movements brisk and clinical. Laura stood in the doorway, paralyzed, as she watched her personal items, silks, cottons, and private keepsakes, being handled and reorganized according to Joyce's inscrutable logic. Joyce reached for the bed, snapping the duvet cover with a sharp crack that sounded like a whip, smoothing out the wrinkles as if trying to erase the very indentation of Laura's body from the mattress. She moved to the vanity next, lining up perfume bottles in a rigid, military formation, their glass flacons clicking against the wood like teeth. The space was being reclaimed, drawer by drawer, until Laura felt the very air in the room pushing her toward the exit, transforming her from the lady of the house into an unwanted spectator at her own displacement. Laura looked over at Mark, who had slumped into his favorite armchair, his face illuminated by the pale, ghostly blue light of his smartphone. He seemed entirely deaf to the rhythmic, violent clatter of pots emanating from the kitchen where Joyce was still finishing up. He didn't even flinch or look up when his mother brushed past him, her hip striking his shoulder as if he were merely an inconvenient piece of furniture in her path. In the hallway mirror, Laura caught her own reflection. A woman becoming transparent, a ghost haunting her own hallways. She saw with a devastating clarity that Mark had chosen the path of least resistance, a quiet surrender that felt more like a betrayal than any shouted argument. His silence was a roar that filled the house, a vacuum where his support should have been. Mark had faded into the background, a part of the static scenery in a play now entirely directed and produced by Joyce. Laura retreated into the bathroom, the porcelain tile cold against her back as she fumbled for the lock. The click of the deadbolt felt like the only victory she had left. Outside the door, the muffled blare of the television and Joyce's authoritative, ringing voice continued to vibrate through the wood. But here, in the small tiled box, the sounds were softened. Laura turned the brass faucet handles, letting the water roar into the basin to drown out the sound of her own ragged, uneven breathing. She looked into the mirror above the sink and saw a stranger with hunted eyes. A woman whose life was being disassembled and reassembled by a thief of identities. The walls of the bathroom seemed to pulse, closing in like the bars of a cage that Mark had helped build with his cowardly neutrality. She sank to the floor, her back sliding against the door, and pulled her knees to her chest as the steam began to fill the small room, blurring the edges of the world. Laura felt her grip on reality dissolving into the white mist. The fluorescent lights of the library office hummed, a persistent, low-frequency buzz that seemed to vibrate inside Laura's skull. She sat motionless before her computer monitor, her eyes widening as the bottom right corner of the screen erupted in a frantic cascade of email notifications. Her hand, cold and trembling, gripped the mouse as she clicked on a message titled, "Support for our dear Laura." The words on the screen, penned with Joyce's characteristic, sharp-edged eloquence, began to swim. Joyce had sent a BCC to the entire department head staff and 3 of the library's board members, confiding in them about Laura's supposed severe emotional collapse and concerning instability. Laura could hear the sudden, sharp silence in the main office outside her door, followed by the low, rhythmic murmur of colleagues whispering. She felt the weight of their pity through the walls. Her fingers dug into the edge of her desk until the wood bit into her skin. Her gaze fixed on the attached scan of a prescription for heavy sedatives, medication she had never requested, let alone been prescribed. A hot, suffocating flush of scarlet climbed her neck, and the air in the small office became a solid, unbreathable mass. Laura stood in the center of the living room, her coat still damp from the morning mist, as she confronted Joyce. The older woman was calmly folding laundry, her movements rhythmic and terrifyingly serene. When Laura demanded an explanation for the emails, for the systematic destruction of her professional reputation, Joyce didn't even look up. "I'm only doing what a mother should," Joyce whispered, her voice like silk over a blade. She spoke of Laura's obvious struggle and the burden of the library job as if they were objective facts. Every time Laura tried to raise her voice, to assert her sanity, Joyce would simply sigh and offer a look of profound, theatrical sadness, as if Laura's anger were merely further proof of her mental decline. The gaslighting was so thorough, so pervasive, that Laura found herself glancing at the mirror, half expecting to see the broken woman Joyce described. The house felt like it was shrinking, the walls leaning inward to eavesdrop on her failure. The afternoon sun was a pale, weak disk behind the clouds as Laura pulled into the parking lot of Sunshine Ray's daycare. She was 20 minutes early, a deliberate attempt to reclaim a small slice of her day with Leo. But as she stepped into the brightly colored lobby, the usual smell of crayons and floor wax felt sour. The receptionist, a woman who usually greeted Laura with a warm smile, now looked at her with a flinching sort of caution. "Your mother-in-law already picked him up, Laura," the woman said, her voice dropping into a register of forced gentleness. "She brought the updated paperwork. The new schedule starts today." Laura felt the floor tilt beneath her. Joyce had used her old power of attorney documents, legal relics from a brief illness years ago, to bypass Laura's authority. The daycare staff, swayed by Joyce's grandmotherly concern and her authoritative former principal persona, had handed over the boy without a single phone call. Laura stood in the empty lobby, surrounded by the ghosts of children's laughter, feeling the absolute weight of her isolation. Mark sat at the kitchen table, his head buried in his hands as Laura recounted the day's events in a voice that shook with a mixture of terror and rage. The kitchen, once a place of warmth, now felt like a sterile interrogation room under Joyce's new high-wattage light bulbs. "She's just trying to help, Laura," Mark whispered, the words sounding hollow and rehearsed. He wouldn't look at her. He wouldn't look at the empty chair where Leo should have been sitting for his afternoon snack. He spoke of compromise and family unity, using the words as shields to protect himself from the discomfort of a confrontation. To Mark, silence was the same as peace, and he was willing to sacrifice Laura's motherhood on the altar of his own tranquility. He was a man drowning in shallow water, refusing to stand up. Laura watched him, seeing not a partner, but a stranger who had already moved into the enemy camp, leaving her to fight a war on two fronts with no ammunition. The back deck of the Whitman house was a stage set for a tragedy. Though the neighbors arriving for the late summer social saw only a picture of suburban perfection. Laura stood by the sliding glass door, her hands trembling as she adjusted the collar of a dress she hadn't chosen. The backyard had been transformed. The wild, comfortable patches of clover Laura loved were gone, replaced by a manicured, chemical green lawn that looked like plastic. Long tables draped in stiff, white linen stretched across the grass, laden with silver platters of rosemary-scented lamb and artisanal cheeses. Joyce was the sun around which the guests orbited, her blue silk suit shimmering as she moved with the grace of a seasoned politician. She laughed, a bright, melodic sound that didn't reach her eyes, as she directed the Harris family to the reserved seats at the head of the table. Laura felt like a shadow, a glitch in the perfect tableau Joyce had constructed. The air was thick with the smell of expensive charcoal and the suffocating floral weight of Joyce's perfume. Laura reached for a platter of stuffed mushrooms, a desperate reflex to appear useful, to ground herself in the tactile reality of hosting. Before her fingers could close around the rim, Joyce's hand shot out, her grip like a steel trap. The older woman didn't just take the plate. She wrenched it away with a force that sent a jolt of pain up Laura's arm. "Not now, dear," Joyce said, her voice loud enough to carry to the nearby cluster of neighbors. She wore a smile that was a masterpiece of condescension. Joyce turned to Mark, thrusting the platter into his hands with a theatrical flourish. She then turned back to Laura, clicking her tongue in a rhythmic, patronizing beat. "Look at those eyes," Joyce announced to the guests, her hand fluttering near Laura's face as if she were examining a sick animal. "The poor thing is just exhausted. I've told her, Laura, leave the heavy lifting to those of us with the energy." Mark stood by, his face a mask of dull gray stone, as Joyce steered him toward the crowd, leaving Laura standing in the wake of her public humiliation. The murmur of the crowd shifted, the tone turning from casual chatter to the hushed, buzzing frequency of a scandal. Laura stood near the drink station, her ears ringing as she caught fragments of Joyce's conversation with Mrs. Green. The words unstable, outbursts, and fragile drifted through the air like toxic ash. Joyce was leaning in close, her hand on Mrs. Green's arm, her face a mask of noble, tragic burden. She spoke of the incidents with Leo, her voice rising just enough to ensure the surrounding neighbors could hear the truth about the boy's home life. Laura saw the glances, quick, darting eyes that looked away the moment she made contact. She was being painted as the villain in a story she hadn't even been allowed to read. Joyce reached over and adjusted Leo's collar for the 10th time that hour, a gesture of ownership that was as violent as a blow. The social circle around Laura widened, a physical manifestation of the isolation Joyce had spent weeks cultivating. Leo was crouched by the edge of the sandbox, his small shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on a plastic truck. Laura saw the confusion in his face, the way he looked at the crowd of strangers with a quiet, simmering fear. She moved toward him, her heart aching with the need to scoop him up and run, to find a place where the air wasn't poisoned by Joyce's lies. But Joyce was a predator, sensing movement. She cut across the grass, her shoulder bumping Laura aside with a sharp, calculated impact. Joyce scooped Leo up, pinning the boy against her hip with a grip that looked agonizingly tight. Leo let out a small, sharp cry of surprise, his little hands clutching at Joyce's silk lapel. "He's overwhelmed," Joyce barked, her voice cutting through the backyard like a siren. She looked directly at Laura, her eyes burning with a cold, triumphant fire. "He needs a real authority figure right now, someone who isn't falling apart." The backyard fell silent, the neighbors frozen with their wine glasses halfway to their lips, witnessing the final, public execution of Laura's maternal rights. Laura's fingers were like iron talons as she gripped Mark's forearm, the heat of her rage radiating through his shirt. She didn't ask. She hauled him toward the garage, her movements jagged and frantic. The heavy, motorized door of the garage descended with a low, industrial rumble, the sound of a tomb sealing shut. The bright, artificial cheer of the party was sliced away, replaced by the dim, dusty shadows of the workspace. The air smelled of stale oil, old lawnmower gas, and the damp concrete floor. Laura shoved Mark back toward the workbench, her strength fueled by a month of suppressed screams. He stumbled, his hip catching the edge of a metal vise, sending a jar of rusted nails crashing to the floor. The sound echoed in the confined space like gunfire. Laura stood over him, her chest heaving, the single naked light bulb overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare across her face. She looked like a woman who had finally stepped out of a burning building, ready to let the world watch it turn to ash. Laura slammed her palms onto the scarred wooden surface of the workbench, pinning Mark into the narrow corner between the tool racks. Her voice didn't rise to a scream. It was something far more terrifying, a low, rhythmic rasp that sounded like a blade being sharpened on a stone. She laid out the ultimatum with the cold precision of a surgeon. "You call a locksmith now," she hissed, her face inches from his. "Before those people leave this yard. Before the sun goes down." She told him that the locks would be changed, and Joyce's key would never turn in them again. If he refused, if he chose the comfort of his mother's shadow one more time, Laura would be gone by dawn. She spoke of a new life for Leo, a life where Mark and Joyce were nothing but faded, ugly memories. She watched a single fat bead of sweat roll down Mark's temple, carving a path through the dust on his skin. The scent of rosemary from the party outside felt like a mockery. Mark looked at Laura as if she were a stranger, a ghost that had suddenly put on flesh and bone. His pupils were blown wide, twin black pits reflecting the shadow she cast against the garage wall. He tried to speak, his jaw working like a landed fish, but no sound emerged. He looked at the workbench, his fingers twitching as they gripped the edge of the wood, his shoulders sagging as if the very air had become too heavy to support. The realization was visible in the way his gaze finally broke. He saw the suitcase she had already half-packed in her mind, saw the empty house, saw the end of the only world he had ever known. The silence in the garage was absolute. A heavy, pressurized void that seemed to hum with the electricity of a coming storm. He looked at her eyes, no longer soft, no longer seeking his approval. And he saw the bridge he had spent years building finally collapse into the sea. The screen door creaked as Laura and Mark stepped back onto the terrace, the late afternoon sun casting long, skeletal shadows across the white linens. Joyce was in the middle of a sentence, a wine bottle tilted over Mrs. Harris's glass, her face a picture of effortless control. Mark didn't hesitate. He walked into the center of the party, his stride heavy and purposeful, until he stood directly in front of his mother. The chatter died down, a wave of silence following him. "Give me the keys, Mom," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a new, jagged edge that cut through the ambient noise of the neighborhood. He held out his hand, palm up, a silent demand that brooked no argument. Laura stood behind him, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the way Joyce's face seemed to melt. The carefully constructed mask of the helpful grandmother, dissolving to reveal the cold, hard porcelain of a tyrant. Joyce dropped the silver cake server, the heavy metal clattering against the patio tiles with a sound that made several guests flinch. Her face, usually so composed, flushed a violent, mottled purple. She didn't look at Mark. She looked at Laura, her fingers snapping up to point like a loaded weapon. "You did this!" Joyce shrieked, the sound raw and ugly, a complete departure from her usual polished tone. She began to howl about ingratitude and betrayal, her voice rising into a jagged, high-pitched frenzy. She claimed Laura was a poison in the family, a woman who was tearing a son from his mother's heart. She grabbed the edge of the tablecloth, her knuckles white, pulling the fabric so hard that a crystal bowl of fruit began to slide toward the edge. A thin line of foam appeared at the corner of her mouth as her accusations became a frantic, incoherent stream of bile. Her eyes darting around the yard, as if searching for an audience that was already beginning to retreat. Mark took a step forward, his shadow falling over Joyce, physically shielding Laura from the older woman's frantic gestures. He didn't raise his voice, which only made the "give me the keys" more devastating. Joyce shifted her tactics instantly, her rage collapsing into a series of wet, theatrical sobs. She clutched at her chest, sinking onto a folding chair as if her heart were failing, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. She wailed about the sacrifices she had made, the sleepless nights she had spent caring for a house that wasn't hers. Mark remained a pillar of salt, his hand still extended, his eyes bored into hers with a cold, unwavering clarity. Laura could feel the heat radiating from Mark's back, a solid wall of protection she hadn't felt in years. The neighbors were now moving in a frantic, silent exodus, abandoning their plates and half-finished drinks as they fled the spectacle of Joyce's total unraveling. Joyce reached into the pocket of her silk jacket and ripped out the heavy brass key ring. With a snarl of pure, concentrated hatred, she whipped the keys at Mark's feet. They hit the patio tiles with a sharp, melodic ring, one key sliding across the stone until it came to rest against the leg of the buffet table. Joyce didn't wait for a reply. She snatched up her designer handbag, nearly upending a tray of glasses as she stormed toward the side gate. Her heels hammered against the concrete path, a staccato rhythm of defeat. The guests followed in her wake, a line of shadows fleeing the wreckage of the party. Laura heard the distant, violent roar of an engine, followed by the screech of tires as Joyce's car tore away from the curb. The silence that followed was heavy and sweet, the first clean air Laura had breathed in months. Laura walked to the center of the patio and knelt, her fingers closing around the cold, sun-warmed metal of the keys. She felt the weight of them in her palm, a physical token of her restored sovereignty. She walked to the front gate, the heavy iron bars cool against her touch, and slid the bolt home. The thunk of the lock was the most satisfying sound she had ever heard. She leaned her forehead against the metal, her eyes closing as the tension that had lived in her neck for weeks finally began to dissipate. The air in the backyard, no longer heavy with the scent of Joyce's perfume or the oily smoke of her cooking, felt light and expansive. Laura took a deep, shuddering breath, her lungs finally expanding to their full capacity. For the first time in an eternity, a slow, genuine smile spread across her face, a quiet bloom of victory in the cooling twilight. The next morning, the air in Minneapolis was crisp, carrying the scent of early autumn. Laura walked into the administrative office of the daycare, her footsteps firm on the linoleum floor. She sat across from the director, her pen moving with a steady, unhurried grace as she filled out the restricted access forms. She didn't hesitate when she reached the section for prohibited individuals. She wrote Joyce's name in large, clear block letters, the ink sinking deep into the paper. She handed the document over and watched as the director pressed a heavy, crimson stamp onto the corner. Special protocol required. As Laura walked back out to her car, she felt a sense of profound, quiet power. She had built a fortress around Leo, a wall of paper and law that Joyce could never hope to breach. The world felt solid again, the boundaries of her life clearly marked and defended. Back at the house, the air felt still and expectant. Laura and Mark stood on either side of the massive mahogany dresser that Joyce had forced into the foyer. Without a word, they both leaned into the heavy wood. The dresser groaned, its feet scraping across the floor as they pushed it back into the shadows of the dining room. Laura watched as the light from the hallway mirror, now returned to its original place, hit the polished wood, restoring the familiar geometry of the house. They moved the bench, they rehung the pictures, and they wiped away the lingering scent of lemon wax. With every object returned to its place, the house seemed to exhale. The walls shedding the oppressive energy Joyce had brought into them. Laura felt the rooms returning to her, the space opening up to welcome her back. Laura stood in Leo's room, the black plastic trash bag at her feet already half full of stiff, scratchy flannel. She moved to the kitchen next, her movements efficient and ruthless. She emptied the refrigerator of the heavy, grease-clotted containers of cabbage and bacon, the smell of them finally vanishing down the disposal. She lit a small ceramic lamp, the scent of lavender beginning to drift through the hallways like a cleansing tide. She slid a tray of fresh dough into the oven, and soon the sharp, medicinal smells of the previous weeks were replaced by the warm, yeasty aroma of baking bread. Laura stood at the clean, white countertop and looked out the window at the backyard. The shadows were gone. The house didn't just smell like home again. It felt like a sanctuary, a place where the only rules were the ones she chose to make. The house was quiet. The only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant rustle of leaves against the window. Laura opened the door to Leo's room and saw him tucked into his bed, his small form draped in the soft cotton pajamas he loved. He looked up at her, his eyes heavy with sleep, a small, trusting smile on his face. Laura sat on the edge of the bed and pulled him into her arms, the scent of his hair, clean, like baby soap, filling her senses. She began to sing, her voice low and steady, a simple melody that had been passed down through generations. As she rocked him, she felt the last of the cold dread leave her body. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was a mother. She was the head of her house, and the song she sang was a promise that the world outside the door would stay exactly where it belonged.